Dwi wedi trefnu'r sesiwn hwn achos o'n i'n ymwybodol bod cymaint o bobl ar draws Cymru eisiau gweld newid, a pa mor anodd yw i greu'r newid sydd eisiau. A mae grwpiau cymunedol sydd yn ymgyrchu dros hyn a'r llall, ac mae cymaint o egni a brwdfrydedd, ond yn aml iawn, dyw hynny ddim yn cyrraedd y Llywodraeth, neu dyw e ddim yn gwneud, mae'n teimlo fel bod ni ddim yn cael effaith mawr. A dwi'n gweld bod yna rhywbeth ar goll felly yn y drefn fel ac y mae, a dyw pethau ddim yn gweithio yn dda iawn. Felly dwi wedi trefnu'r sesiwn hwn mwyn ymchwilio i'r broblem yna, y cwestiwn yna. Beth sydd eisiau wneud mwyn cysylltu y pobl cywir yn y trefn cywir fel bod ni cael y newid ni eisiau gweld. So dyna'r meddylfryd tu hwnt i'r sesiwn yma. Dwi'n gyffrous iawn y siaradwyr sydd gyda ni y bore yma i drafod hynny. Yes, Camilla Saunders is from Knighton. And Camilla came to me through a friend of a friend, actually. It's a very happy accident. And I think I'll let Camilla explain for herself the wonderful work that she's involved with in Knighton. So over to you, Camilla. I'm sort of roughly timing you for 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Jane, for organising this session and letting me speak. I live in Knighton, which is just across the border from Shropshire. And I'm part of a group called Sustainable Food Knighton, and I'm just going to give you a bit of background on how we started and why and what we've been up to. We've been going about two and a half years. So our local town council declared a climate emergency in April 2019, and we all felt quite excited about that and inspired. But shortly afterwards, Karen in our group discovered that an application to build an IPU, that's an intensive poultry unit, had been submitted by a farm at the edge of town, and it was supported by our town council. And this seemed so totally wrong and counterproductive, because we know that intensive agriculture is one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions globally. We felt we had to do something, and thus Sustainable Food Knighton was born. I don't think any of us realised at the time what a huge task we were taking on, and I think it's just as well because we probably wouldn't have even started. And although lots of different people have given us much valued support at different times, there are actually only 4 of us in the core group, and I think we're all here today, and I hope the others will say something as well. We've all learnt a lot. Now, Paris has been dubbed the poultry capital of Europe, as the proportion of intensively reared chickens to humans is the highest known in the continent. That's about 64 per person and rising. So we researched the effects of nitrates and phosphates in chicken poo that kill off plants and pollute rivers. Also, nitrogen combines with oxygen to produce nitrous oxide, which is a major greenhouse gas and sticks around longer than methane, actually. Chickens are fed a concentrated feed, which is based on imported soya, which means we export the emissions to other countries. And soya cultivation uses lots of water and is contributing to deforestation and social unrest in South America. Ammonia, which also comes off IPUs, can travel through the air on particulates and cause or aggravate lung and heart disease. And while one chicken farm miles from a centre of population might not be very harmful to biodiversity and human health, the cumulative effect of the hundreds of chicken farms in Paris is significant and shocking. As for the chickens, they lead short, unpleasant lives imprisoned in sheds. They're not even given the dignity of being called animals, they're referred to as a crop. So we had help and advice from CPRW, that's Council for Protection of Rural Wales, who've done a lot of work on intensive poultry units, and an excellent planning advisor, Helen Hamilton. We raised funds and commissioned Helen to write an objection and tried to gather as many other objections from local people as possible. Sadly, the Welsh Government, local councils and the NFU are actively encouraging farmers to build IPUs as a form of diversification so that family farms can keep going. But in fact, only farmers who've got capital or are able to obtain large loans can even think about taking them on. It's a huge amount of initial layout. The farmers don't own the units, they're tied into a contract with a big corporation, and round here it's usually Avara, which is a merger of Cargill, Buhis and Fashenda, who provide the chicks and feed, collect them for slaughter and dispose of diseased or prematurely dead animals. The chicks grow very fast on the soya and they're deemed ready to slaughter after 36 days, and they can hardly move by then anyway. We also discovered how opaque the planning process is. Any time you want to view an objection to a planning application, at least in Powys, you have to make a freedom of information request, as the council refused to publish them on their website, citing data protection. And in January 2019, Powys Council changed their own rules so that planning officers can make a decision on an application under delegated powers without it being heard by the full committee. And in theory, if the applications are for an IPO of a certain size, it should be heard by the full committee, but you're never sure about that. So we complained about lack of democracy, but that was to no avail. Then there's the matter of existing Welsh legislation. For a start, the Welsh Government declared a climate emergency in April 2019 and published Prosperity for All, a low-carbon Wales. And this states the need for, I quote, reducing the impact on our natural resources, which does not mean increasing animal numbers and intensifying farming, end of quote. The Welsh Government also passed the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act for Wales in 2015, requiring all public bodies to think about the long-term consequences of their decisions. It's a really wonderful piece of legislation, but in respect of agriculture, it's been totally ignored by planners and by Welsh ministers. We wrote to the government, we even visited the Senedd in 2019, but neither Julie James, Head of Planning, or Leslie Griffiths, Head of Farming and the Environment, had time to talk to us. They saw no reason to oppose llanlleu or IPUs in general. And Leslie Griffiths assured us she was working on de-intensification of farming and even had a working group to deal with it. But since COVID, I haven't heard anything else. We didn't get anywhere with NRW, Natural Resources Wales, and they also have to give their approval to any IPU application. They're meant to ensure that Welsh biodiversity is increased, not just maintained, and people within NRW have really spoken out against intensifying, particularly the poultry units. So despite our objections, demonstrations and publicity, the application was approved under the infamous delegated powers in October last year. At that point, Helen, our planning advisor, said she'd help us apply for a judicial review of the decision, and after discussion we decided to go ahead with that. Helen found a barrister from the Environmental Law Foundation who worked pro bono, and Buxton's lawyers whose solicitor worked on a no-win, no-fee basis. The whole legal team were magnificent. We felt really privileged to have them. They were great. And the JR process was amazing. It was also one of the most stressful things I've ever done. We had wonderful support, not just locally, but nationally. People were really generous and gave donations, which meant we could go ahead. But before we actually had the JR, the council settled out of court and admitted that the manure management plan was insufficient. The case attracted plenty of media attention and was regarded as a victory. But although we were deemed to have won, as someone put it, a battle, not a war, I felt quite ambivalent about it. We were all pretty tired by the end, and we knew they'd reapply. And of course, there's always some people who think we're trying to ruin the lives and well-being of local farmers, even though we always make it very clear that's not why we have this campaign. Local campaigns such as this can be awkward and divisive and pose questions that are currently not being answered by those authorities who do have the power to make the changes. What are local communities to do when governments and local councils aren't abiding by their own laws and local politics is distinctly tribal? What is local democracy? How can local communities be included in decisions about land use and food growing when these directly affect them and their surroundings, but they own no land, never will, and have no say in policy? The chickens from IPUs aren't sold locally, they're processed and sold through supermarkets. And the proponents of IPUs defend them on the grounds that this is locally produced food, and if we don't have them, there will be more and more dodgy trade deals with countries with even lower welfare standards than ours. And they're providing, they say, poor people with cheap food. I find both those arguments really depressing and very flawed. Why not work to create a system where everybody can afford decent food, which is the theme of this conference, and get everybody working together so the dodgy trade deals and the IPUs become redundant? Rather than blaming each other, we have to be clear that supermarkets and huge companies like Cargill are screwing farmers and consumers to up their own profits and trashing the planet. And it's global. Asia and the Americas are full of intensive pig and chicken farms, which I hadn't realised before. Anyway, Llanlleu Farm reapplied. They added ammonia scrubbers to their initial plan and arranged to export the manure to a biodigester, which is actually 60 miles away in Shropshire, across the border, contributing to more emissions. This time, at least, there was a full planning committee hearing, and Karen and I were allowed to speak. And councillors did admit that climate change is a serious concern, and exporting chicken poo to Shropshire is a just-in-time policy that could easily break down. Nonetheless, we were told to take our concerns to Westminster, about concerns about climate change at least, and the new application was passed 15-1. Now, just before all this, through the mediation of MS Jane Dodds, a couple of us, Caroline and myself, went and met a farmer who has an IPU near Llandod, and also a rep from the NFU. We were all women, and Jane Dodds joined us. And both the farm and the NFU reps said they wanted to try and improve the images of farmers whom they feel are always blamed and presented in a bad light, And that was quite ironic because that's what we feel a lot of the time too. It was a really good discussion. We all felt included, and we listened to each other, even though we disagreed. We had a good listen and chat. And so we'd like to try and meet more farmers, including organic and regenerative farmers, but also, if possible, more so-called conventional, although there's nothing conventional about an IPU. So now we're deciding our next steps. It's unlikely we'll make any further objections or take other legal action. We feel at this stage it could be harmful and polarise the local community. And actually, unless we can find new grounds for objection, it wouldn't succeed. And we could use our energy on some other projects that aren't about IPUs. But I do feel frustrated that a small group such as ours, and there's many such groups across Powys and in other parts of Wales and England, taking on equally Herculean struggles against IPUs. I feel frustrated any of us should be having to do any of it, because ultimately the government, councils and NRW aren't doing their job or abiding by Wales's own legislation. I think people here would agree that intensive farming of any kind is not a fit method of food production for the 21st century and the challenges of a changing climate. We now want to keep up the pressure on Senate members and ministers to de-intensify Welsh farming, and we really love some help. We're up against very powerful corporate lobbies for corporations and individuals. It isn't easy, but we know that most of the world's food comes from plant cultivation and mixed farming methods, generally produced on small farms by independent women farmers outside Europe. We need to explore and pursue this model, but how do we do it when there's no political will? That's what we're trying to work out now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Thank you, Camilla, for an excellent presentation there. There's just so much there to pick up on. Right, okay. So, Chris.
Apologies, that was always going to happen, which is my firm's entire Outlook system crashed at 1:45. So there's been complete mad panic here. But look, I'm very glad to be here. I know some of you, but not most of you. I'm the new chair of the Welsh inquiry of the Food Farming and Countryside Commission. And one of the reasons why I was asked to do this is that I'm not a familiar face in this community. I'm pretty well known in public life across Wales in a number of other sectors. Got quite a few things done, and the Commission wanted me to bring some of that experience into this arena. So I caught a large part of what Camilla had to say. Jane, I don't know whether you've introduced Howell or whether I should do that.
No, you introduce the rest. You can take over. I haven't done anything other than introduce Camilla.
Well, I was hoping, I'm Welsh, but I'm not a natural Welsh speaker, and I was hoping to be in the session earlier so I could ask Howell how to spell the name of his farm correctly. I didn't get that chance, so I'm going to have a punt. But he farms at Esgath Llaethdy Meddfa in the western end of Brecon Beacons, which is a family upland hill and all grass farm with very low inputs. His cattle, sheep and Welsh mountain ponies also graze on adjoining common land to manage the vegetation. But his regenerative and conservation grazing produces high nutrition red meat, which he says he sells direct to some consumers. And I'm hoping that in what he's going to talk to us about, which in essence is around the excessive carbon offset forestation, is also going to include a little bit of more about his farm than I said there, because we'd all be interested in it. So Hal, sorry not to have met you before, but can I pass the baton on to you?
Yeah, diolch Chris, pnawn da pawb, a diolch am gwahoddiad i'r cyngor heddi. Diolch I Jane, trefnu a criw. Fel dywedodd Chris, Hywel Morgan yw'r enw, rydym yn fferman Esgath Llaethdy, so eitha da Chris, da iawn. Mae ddau gerll yn dyfru yn y Parc Banau Brycheinog. Yeah, so I'll turn to the English because I've written my notes in English. Sorry, Jane and everyone, but I'm a fluent Welsh speaker, but for some reason I'm more comfortable talking in English. As Chris said, I farm with a low input system, no fert, no chemicals, very little bought in feed, some sheep feed bought in the spring if a grass growth is a bit slow. Practice some regenerative farming and similar to organic system, but not certified yet. So pretty much I'll talk about trees today. First of all, I love trees. I plant trees. I got lots of trees on my farm. 15% of my farm is covered in trees. Plus I plant about 1,000 meters a year in new hedgerows and manage hedges. I don't cut my hedges every year. We just trim a little bit off the side and just manage them, which my hedging contractor doesn't like. But I think our hedges are vital to my farming system. It's exposed hill farm, and shelter from a wind and rain and from hot sunny days is vital. So basically, currently we're seeing a huge land grab of upland farms in the area by corporations, city investors, barristers and lawyers and solicitors. Funny enough, barristers and lawyers and solicitors, they seem to know the ins and outs of these rules, and they might be looking into the future, because at the moment I can't see it paying. Much of this is driven by carbon offsetting and the tree planting driven by Welsh government tree planting ambitions and the creation of a national forest, which my farm is bang in the middle of a proposed national forest. Surely using public money to help London-based corporations to offset their carbon pollution isn't good for rural communities, the Welsh language, culture, traditions, food, security, and more importantly, our next generation farmers. We currently have lots of biodiversity habitats, and are we in danger of losing these to these tree plantations sort of thing? If a London-based or English-based company buys Welsh farms to offset their carbon, does that or could it make Welsh carbon, Wales carbon positive? This is something I've asked my AM, my MP sort of thing to pick up in the Senedd of the Welsh government, which they did ask Leslie Griffiths, and she refused to answer them. So most of the farms coming on of a market are snapped up by investors, but local agents seem happy with this, and they're happy to pay, as they're happy to pay the asking price or over, and the money tends to be safe. And I have, like I said, I have nothing against trees, but the right tree in the right place and who benefits is the key. Finding a balance between biodiversity and productivity, whether that's trees or food, is key, sort of thing. I'm concerned with what, or rather what not, Welsh Government or other organisations such as NRW, National Park, Welsh local authorities are actually doing currently. To put it bluntly, we're having too much talking and no action. Farmers are getting frustrated, and I'm, for one, really getting frustrated. I discuss with Welsh Government officials quite often. James Sowen was on earlier. I discuss with James quite often. And I can't understand how one department in government can find money for tree planting, and then the next department, another department, says they don't have any money, waiting on the UK government to give them funding. Surely with a climate emergency, we need to act today. In 3 years' time or 4 years' time, in 2025, when the proposed new sustainable land scheme comes into place, a lot of damage was done to rural Wales, and especially the uplands. Another benefit of an investor buying uplands, they're having hectares allocated on these commons through a 1964 Act, Registration Act of the Commons Act, that they even have hands-on extra land. And currently, they're having BPS, like all farmers having BPS payments, but a lot of these BPS payments are going to the wrong hands. For example, barristers near me, they having lots of money, I won't say how much, but lots of money just for the luxury of owning land with grazing rights and commons. Surely we have to change. Yes, we are changing, but another 3-4 years of this sort of system, we're going to do a lot of damage. The future generations, hardly anything has been said or discussed regarding the next generation farmers. And I got 2 young kids. I just become a granddad yesterday, and I am concerned about their future of if they want to farm. And both my kids are keen on farming. One works on a farm, and the other one enjoys helping dad out, sort of thing. But we need opportunity. Like I was saying, the current BPS system deters young entrants into farming, whether by encouraging investors to buy upland farms or keep the old semi-retired farmer on the land by giving them financial support. As is a food democracy subject, I thought I'll also point out a few facts about food security and production. We do currently produce enough food in the world to feed everyone, but distribution, government and warlords and food waste get in the way. 1 in 9 people still are undernourished. 39% of people, adult population, are overweight. And another fact that I heard last week, that only 5% of the lamb we produce in Wales is consumed here. Let's get the government, schools, hospitals, local authority to eat more of the food we produce here in Wales and not just chicken. I really appreciate what Camilla just said, but unfortunately our society seems to be just want to eat chicken. We need education in schools, agriculture callers to promote farming with nature maybe, and how the schools need to bring back cookery lessons and teach the children how to cook meals with food that producer, whether it's beef, lamb or vegetables sort of thing. When I was on the Agri Academy leadership program, Welsh government civil servants were actually pushing us as farmers to build chicken sheds, which I was amazed sort of thing. And I'll just finish off quickly by just repeating my message of finding the balance between biodiversity and productivity is a key. And as Wales, we need to make sure this public money stays in Wales, not fund London-based pension fund with offsetting carbon here, and eventually will that make Wales carbon positive? I'm not sure. Joel, thank you.
Well, Howell, thank you. One of the things I'd like to try and do at the end is try and pick up the themes, and I think every theme was in there. That was a powerful, and I'm going to pick up biodiversity and productivity as a key link in perhaps the solution to a lot of what you talked about. Can I now introduce Sian Stacey, please? Sian is Project Development Officer for Mynydd y Môr Summit to the Sea project, which we'll all have heard about, based in mid Wales. She's currently facilitating a co-design process with the local community as key stakeholders, having worked with the project since August 2019, and has endeavoured to bring the voice of the community to the table during the original project, and was involved in the transition to relaunch it in June 2020 with RSPD Cymru as hosts. Prior to this, Sian worked for Cowen, the food and drink programme at Menthra business, and had what seems to me is the dream job of island manager at Bardsey Island. Sian, you're going to talk about your project, so I'm going to pass over to you if I may.
Enw yw Sian, a fi sy'n cydlynu'r prosiect o'r Mynydd i'r Môr, fel mae'n cael ei galw ar hyn o bryd. Mae'n prosiect cyd-ddylunio ac oedd gyda fi diddordeb mawr gwrando ar James Owen o Llywodraeth Cymru yn gynharach yn sôn am prosiect cyd-ddylunio nhw. So bydd e'n diddorol gweld mwy am hynny yn y dyfodol. Felly, jyst i rai pobl sydd ddim wedi clywed am y prosiect o'r blaen, mae'r prosiect yn seiliedig yn canolbarth Gymru. Dyn ni'n cymryd yr afon Dyfi yn y gogledd, lawr at yr Rheidol yn Aberystwyth fel cyrion y prosiect fel y mae, a wedyn mewn i Llanidloes yn y Dwyrain ac allan lan i Pumlemon a lawr i'r Môr y Meicradigion fel yr ochr gorllewin. So dyma yw'r ardal dyn ni'n gweithio yn. Mae gynddon ni 6 prosiect partner yn y prosiect gyda RSPB Cymru yn cynnal y prosiect ar hyn o bryd. Efallai bod rhai o chi wedi clywed am gorffennol y prosiect, felly nath y cychwyn y prosiect fod yn eitha disastrous, really. Oedd nifer o wahanol issues o fewn y prosiect. Un o'r pethau Sorry, mae'n eitha swnllyd yn Aberystwyth ar hyn o bryd. un o'r pethau dwi wastad eisiau wneud yn siŵr bod fi'n rhannu yn glir efo pobl yw oedd na pushback gryf iawn gen lot fawr o'r gymuned, ond y peth pwysig i cyfathrebu yw nid jyst criw o fatha ffermwyr grumpy oedd hynny, oedd na pwyntiau pwysig iawn yn wneud i pobl becso am be oedd y prosiect cychwynnol am biti, a felly pan nes i cychwyn blwyddyn yn ôl i'r prosiect cychwyn, job cyntaf fi rili oedd i mynd allan a gwrando ar pryderon bobl ac i clywed ar be oedd pobl yn pryderu drosto, ac oedd lot o nifer o rhesymau bwysig iawn yn sgil hynny. Felly nath y prosiect al cychwyn, wnaeth RSPB Cymru cymryd drosodd fel yr rhai oedd yn cynnal y prosiect, a nath y prosiect newid o rhywbeth oedd yn cael ei gweithredu i rhywbeth oedd yn mynd nôl reit i'r fatha cychwyn a ddatblygu rhywbeth oedd yn lot fwy lleol, oedd yn cael ei gyrru'n lleol, ac oedd yn cael pobl lleol yn rhan o hynny hi. Ac oherwydd hynny, ni wedi bod yn wneud hyn drwy proses o cyd-dylunio. Mae gynnu fi slaid nesaf yw plan Llywodraeth Cymru, cyd-dylunio nhw, fel mae'n edrych. Ond na, dyma beth mae ymynedd fi yn edrych ar y cyfan, felly dyma beth mae cyd-dylunio yn gallu teimlo fel, a dyma lle ydyn ni, dwi'n meddwl, ar hyn o bryd yn y proses. Dwi'n meddwl peth pwysig i ddeud yw mae'n bwysig i chi bod yn gyfforddus ac yn agored i teimlo'n digon gyfforddus i fod yn sefyllfa ansicr pan ydych chi'n cydlynu rhywbeth sy'n cyd-dylunio. A hefyd bod ni'n gweithio fel cyd-dylunio, dyn ni ddim jyst yn defnyddio fe i wneud i'n gwaith ymgysylltu edrych yn dda, ni'n wneud o i ddod â pobl o wahanol cefndiroedd at ei gilydd ac i geisio cynnal trafodaethau a draws wahanol gymunedau. Fel rili dyn ni wedi clywed hi belled heddiw. So mae fe am biti rhannu pŵer a fatha cymryd sylw o pryd mae yna cydbwysedd yn pŵer o fewn cymunedau. Mae fe am biti blaenoriaethau perthnasau. Mae'n sicrhau bod pobl yn gallu cymryd rhan mewn wahanol ffurfiau. Ella bod cynnal pethau ar Zoom ddim pob tro'n gweithio i bobl. A hefyd bod ni'n meithrin gallu, felly build capacity. Felly o ran beth ni wedi bod yn wneud, wel, wnaethon ni cychwyn drwy setio a fframio'r trafodaeth, ac oedd hwnna'n cychwyn gyda gweithdai lle o'n ni'n gofyn y cwestiwn beth ydy dyfodol lle mae natur a pobl yn ffynnu yn edrych fel. Dwi'n cofio gweld bore yma yn y chat oedd rhywun yn deud I can only achieve what I can first imagine. Felly dyna oedd bwriad fatha cychwynnol y prosiect yw i helpu ni i meddwl am be oedd dyfodol gwell yn edrych fel. Ac o hynny wedyn nathon ni dechrau ddatblygu be oedd y gweledigaeth yna'n edrych fel a'r prif themau oedd yn eistedd o fewn yr gweledigaeth yna. O ran pwy dyn ni wedi siarad efo hyd belled, ni wedi cynnal nifer o gweithdai rhithiol ar-lein, ond hefyd gweithdai wyneb i wyneb o'r diwedd pan oedd canllawiau Covid yn caniatáu. Ni wedi bod yn ddatblygu grŵp cyswllt o dros 30 o pobl lleol sy'n cynrychioli naill ai grwpiau cymunedol neu cynghorau sir lleol, pobl fel yr Undeb Amaethyddwyr Cymru, nifer fawr o wahanol pobl sydd yn trial fatha creu sefyllfa lle mae wahanol elfennau o'r gymuned yn cael llais ar y bwrdd fel y mae. Dyn ni hefyd wedi gwario dros yr haf yma yn siarad efo busnesau sydd yn gwneud ennill eu bywoliaeth nhw o'r adnoddau naturiol. Felly, mae rai pobl yn galw nhw ffermydd, ond pobl sy'n gweithio gyda coedwigaeth hefyd, bysgota. So, unrhyw fath o busnes sydd yn defnyddio'r adnoddau naturiol ac yn cael effaith arnyn nhw, neu eto hefyd pobl fatha cwmnïau twristiaeth fel Beicio Mynydd ac ati. Ac oedd hwnna'n ffordd dda iawn achos o siarad efo nhw am y prosiect, am syniadau nhw at y dyfodol a gael mewnbwn nhw i'r proses cyd-dylunio, achos nhw sy'n bia rhan fwyaf o'r tir yn yr ardal yma, felly mae'n bwysig tu hwnt gael llais nhw o gwmpas y fwrdd. Felly beth mae'n edrych fel hyd hyn, felly mae'r weledigaeth, ecosystemau cysylltiedig a llawn natur o'r tir i'r môr, sy'n cyflawni buddion i fywyd gwyllt a pobl heddiw ac i genedlaethau'r dyfodol, ond sydd hefyd yn dathlu'r tryftadaeth a diwylliant yr ardal. Mae'r 4 thema, so mae rhain i gyd wedi dod trwy'r proses cyd-dylunio. Systemau cynhyrchu sy'n gynaladwy ac yn gobeithio o'r natur, well cysylltiad rhwng cynefinoedd, ailgysylltu pobl a defnydd tir a môr yn bwysig. So pobl o fewn yr trefi neu'r pentrefi sy'n teimlo'n fod yr cysylltiad efo sut mae'r tir yn cael ei rheoli wedi torri, ond hefyd cysylltiad efo ni a natur, a wedyn ailgysylltu'r economi. O reina, wedyn mae gynnon ni rhestr hir o syniadau'r cymuned, a dyn ni wedi ceisio dod ar ein at ei gilydd mewn i fatha 5 prif approach, a mae'r sleid nesaf yn reit drafft ar hyn o bryd, ond mae gynnon ni fatha proses o sut fydd y prosiect yn gallu gael ei gweithredu. Dwi'n rhedeg mas amser, dwi'n meddwl, felly na ddim yn mynd i'r manylder o hyn, achos dwi jyst eisiau sôn am beth sydd wedi gweithio i ni yn y proses yma. Amser yw'r peth, amser dwi'n rhedeg mas o heddiw, ond amser i siarad a amser i fod yn agored i siarad am ystod eang o bethau efo pobl. Yr bosibilrwydd o cydweithio, so ni wedi cydweithio gyda nifer o pobl sydd ar y galwad heddiw, pobl wych yn yr ardal, fel Aber Food Surplus, a'r prosiect ymylon yr Rheidol, ond hefyd gyda mentor mynyddoedd Cambria hefyd, a cael pobl lleol hefyd i helpu siapio'r syniadau. So mae gynnon ni tîm o bobl sy'n rhan o'r prosiect sy'n pobl lleol. Beth sydd wedi bod yn anodd yr amser, so mae pethau fel hyn yn cymryd amser, ond mae hefyd angen i ni gael dealltwriaeth bod angen gweithio ar amser mae ymddiried yn datblygu, so work at the pace of trust. Ond hefyd bod yna lot o bobl allan yn teimlo bod yna, mae angen i gweithredu nawr, felly mae'r amser am trafod wedi bennu. So mae yna balans i gael yn hynny. Wrth gwrs mae Covid wedi bod yn rhwystyr i ni, mae siarad dros paned a picio'r ymlaen wastad yn well na siarad dros Zoom. A hefyd mae hanes y prosiect dal i effeithio sut mae bobl yn teimlo a'r teimlad nhw o gallu cymryd rhan. A dwi hefyd jyst wedi cynnwys yr proses cyd-dylunio am cynllun ffermio cynaladwy i Gymru. Mae'r amseru o hwnna wedi fod yn anodd i ni hefyd i ddatblygu syniadau sydd yn gallu helpu ffermwyr lleol, ond hefyd sydd ddim yn mynd i rhoi nhw ar y troi nôl cyn i'r cynllun newydd yma cychwyn. Felly cwpl o bethau sydd wedi bod yn bach o sialens i ni. Felly dwi'n gobeithio bod fi ddim wedi mynd rhy hwyr dros yr amser, ond gyffroes iawn i cymryd rhan yn y trafodaeth heddiw, a diolch i Jane am y croeso heddiw.
Well, diolch, Sian. Thank you. Well, that was you translating me then. It's your turn now to ask questions. Can I introduce Beth Bell, please? Beth is working on a Food Ethics Council project called Food Citizenship, and she's going to help coordinate any questions in the discussion we're going to have. Beth, do you want to talk to that a second?
Sure, thanks. And just thanks to Jane for inviting me here. It's just absolutely wonderful and inspiring and maddening and all those great things to hear from all of you. So yeah, I work for the Food Ethics Council on kind of building food citizenship movement, which is a movement that believes in the power of people, that wants to kind of have us think of ourselves as something more than just consumers, being able to recognize ourselves as citizens, and the choices and responsibilities and rights and power that comes with that, and our ability to influence food and farming systems for the better. So the better for communities, the better for farmers and producers, and the better for the planet. And I think, speaking to the conversation today, a really important aspect of citizenship is like the conditions that are needed to make sure that everybody's voice is heard, that everybody's voice is valued. So those kind of words like inclusive and accessible and respectful and equal are really important. And so too is listening. So really listening to what's being said, recognizing that we're human and that we're all human. We're all, for the most part, trying to do the best we can with what we've got. And really the importance of trying to understand a different point of view, even if you don't agree with it. And all of that is within the kind of context that, you know, for that to work, we must have trust and we must have good faith. And certainly I feel like there's an abundance of both of those things in the many rooms today. So with that in mind, we've got an opportunity now for questions of the speakers and discussion. I will ask you, if you want to ask a question, to raise your hand using the emojis at the bottom. If you're comfortable to speak, do it like that. Raise your hand using the emoji, and I'll come to you and ask you to unmute yourself. And if you prefer just to put a question in the chat, and I can read the question. If you just want to say in the chat who your question's for, or if it's for everybody, we can certainly do that too. So, anything else, Chris, before we kick off?
Yeah, well, while people are formulating their questions, the theme from up to our three speakers is the action of community. You've got Hal talking about his unrest, community unrest, about what they're seeing around carbon offset forestation and the manner that's being dealt with. Then with Camilla, you've got community action, where their communities have actually pulled together and done something and achieved something in their judicial review and the like. And then with Sian, we've actually got a more formal scheme that started in a planned method. So you've kind of got various grades of community action. I was wondering, maybe Sian, if I put this over to you first of all, but others please come in. What's the next step above that? And because how do we get, we've got three there. How do we get 1 + 1 + 1 to make 4? How do we get the community voice at the next level?
Yeah, I think that's a really good kind of pick up from everybody's discussions today. It's something that's come out quite strongly in our co-design process, is an absolute frustration with people locally feeling like they're not able to influence the policy. People concerned that things are happening around them, like we've heard from Howell, where there is a sense of a lack of being able to kind of influence that. And I think in a way, the original iteration of Summit to Sea is perhaps also a good example of how the community got together and really pushed back against something and were very effective. And I think that was, you know, all praise to that actually, which might sound odd coming from me as someone that works from the project, but I kind of joined at that point of change. And we've absolutely heard, you know, how can this project perhaps, or something that already exists in the area, be more of that kind of transitionary communication tool for people locally to say, we're really concerned, this isn't working for us, because it sounds like the things that are set up for that aren't quite working. So NRW maybe isn't working properly. We hear kind of Camilla's frustrations at that. Are the Welsh government systems working? You know, on paper, we've got all these amazing sounding things in Wales, the Future Generations Act, but how is it actually happening and being effective for us and for our nation of people?
Beth, I saw in the chat room Patrick Hannay mentioning citizens' assemblies as a bypass to the short-termism of normal democracy, which kind of fits into Sian's final point there, which was, you're right, Sian, there are groups that we have in Wales, and you named 3 of them. One of which I work with for Future Generation Commission. I work very quickly, and it's a bunch of very able, well-meaning people and achieving a lot. But there's a sense that it's not attacking and not dealing with this particular. It's not picking up here properly. I'm not and what's it within the Future Generations Commission, within the Act? It's public service board, isn't it? It's intended to be. I'm not sure, Patrick, whether you think you have in mind citizens' assemblies, the public service boards, or something different that's a more long-term form of democracy.
Yeah, can I come in here, Chris? Okay, I think the best way to deal with this is through consumers, because consumers are really powerful. You know, they ultimately decide what they eat, buy, or where, doesn't matter. But supermarkets are controlling. So I'm not sure who's in control, the supermarkets or the consumers. I think the consumers have the power, but the supermarkets have the control. So I think we need consumers to take it back in their control. So demand on food produced locally and produced to how we want it produced. And just tell the supermarkets, this is what we want. If you're not happy with chicken sort of in producing big chicken sheds, don't buy it sort of thing. The trouble is, you know, chicken is classic. It's too cheap sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, for what we get. Is it nourishment? Is it nutritional food at the end of the day? I'm not sure. You know, it's like our hospitals and schools and education, government, etc. They've been talking for years about local procurement, but they're not actually doing anything sort of thing. You know, if you're going to hospital or your children going to school, demand on better quality food. I was talking to a head teacher. She has 2 schools in her control, and she said the food in school is shocking sort of thing. This is our future, and we are feeding them substandard food. If the human body was an engine, you wouldn't put this substandard food in that engine, would we?
Well, you raise a fabulous point, Hal, because if the moment which the supermarkets, if we call it, got this, almost the problem will be fixed. Look at it glibly. But Sian spoke French earlier, and she spoke better French than I can speak, but I spent a lot of time over there. And you can't buy cheap chickens in France. It's a prized product. It's not a volume product. And I've often wondered how it's reached that particular position over there as compared over here. But as consumers only have the democracy of their own spend, their individual spend. That's like their protest vote is not to buy it. What you're sort of advocating is a wider voice than that, I think. And I'm wondering whether that comes back to Patrick's point about citizens' assemblies.
Yeah, I might come to Vicky. I think, and Vicky's had your hand up, that they've got a point about citizens' assemblies. I know you've put something in the chat, but do you want to share it?
There was 2 points. One was about deliberative democracy, because you don't have to go down the exact route of citizens' assembly in order to achieve the essence of its benefits. And in Wales, we have smaller societies, so we can do randomized selection and still be inclusive, as Sian has mentioned. But it is a very powerful tool which complements representative democracy to work together, they're not instead of. But coming back to Welsh Government's policies and things like the offsetting and so on, it's very common that a good project goal is lost because the details are wrong. So you have to get the details right, which is another reason to go to the citizens' assembly model. So offsetting isn't something wrong with the principle, actually, but how it works out is very damaging very often. The last time I did it was counterproductive in a big way. We funded the polluters, and that's being mooted again as a thing to do, plus losing agricultural land to solar panels and forests, especially close to where the food is needed, like around towns, isn't foolishness incarnate. So it's getting the details right. And it's the same with, a whole bundle of things like how you insulate, how you put in renewable energy. Unless you get the details right, it's often counterproductive at best. I mean, it's waste of money at best, counterproductive quite often. So that's why you need the citizens involved in making the decisions, but in a deliberative manner, so they're fully informed before they make any decisions. And that takes a bit of time. Yeah, that'll do.
Lovely. Thank you. Stephen Jacobs, I think, just pivoting a little bit to kind of how to actually have people be informed about kind of land use and food sourcing and so on. Stephen, do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think to some extent why I put in the thing was there's the need to educate or re-educate people as to value. And something Howell said earlier, and I'm sure we're all doing it. It's just how do we coordinate it? It's like Howell said, my kids too at school, the food is appalling, so we give them food to take because I'm not having them when they were little, used to let them have a treat of having a cooked dinner there, but it was so appalling, even my children turned their nose up to it. And there is this nonsense that, oh, well, it's expensive. Well, it's not, because half of what you put in front of them goes in the bin. So it's how do we turn all of that around whilst the vested interest, the economic models of businesses is to sell more, sell more, sell more, which is why for the last 3, 4, 5 decades, people have known that that model leads to climate change that becomes irreversible and damages people's lives. And it's carrying on. But one of the things that we can say about Wales is, I would say about Wales, is that Wales has the potential, because it has some culture left, that I'm afraid is even less evident across England. It has some culture left. Is there enough to build upon so that we can get that value agreed amongst us? That sounds really heavy. I'll tell a joke now.
Yeah, can I come in there? Yeah, sure. Sir Steve. When I was on the Agri Academy, we had a session with how to lobby government. And the only thing I took out of that session was anybody and everybody can lobby government. You don't have to be part of an union. You don't have to be part of a group. You can lobby government on your own. Now we're out of the EU. We got devolved government in Wales. And I think most of us will know either an MP or an AM or see regular basis. When it was in the EU or just UK, Westminster, how often could you sort of bump into your local representative? And you know, if I can do it, sort of a meet up with politicians, where the AM, MP, you just send them an email. You know, most of them are on social media, point out what is happening. When I raised with my AM and MP about tree planting with city investors and corporations, they were totally unaware of it. And you know, they've thanked me for highlighting this issue for them. So you know, if you've got something you need to discuss or raise a point with your politician, they might not agree, but you know, they feel obliged to do something about it. Yes, as a group of people, we're stronger, but you know, individually we can do something. And as far for poor standard food in the schools, sort of, just tell your head teacher, she'd be thinking the same, and she can help out. Okay.
Thanks, Howell.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. There's a bit of a discussion in the chats, Patrick and Liz. So Patrick, Hannah is making a point around kind of getting beyond activism around what we don't want to activism to what we do. So that's that kind of, you know, imagining and sharing a better future.
Beth, I can see Camilla wants to come in on what Hal was saying.
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
I just wanted to say that we really, you know, we tried, we went to the Senedd, we're prepared to go again, but it needs vast quantities of people, because it's too easy to dismiss, you know, half a dozen people. I mean, I think if all the people here who feel really strongly about the lack of democracy and how much real need and desire there is for change, actually, if we could all come together and have something, you know, have hundreds of us at the Senedd, it needs that. I don't think just a few people plodding along and, you know, they were all, I mean, for goodness sake, we even got to talk to, what's his face, Neil Houghton. He was, oh yeah, we hate IP. You know, it's got to, it needs a lot of energy. And I mean, I'd be very happy to do that, but I don't want to have to do it on my own or with just a small group. Thanks.
I could just comment on that, Camilla, having, you know, worked lobbying with the Welsh Government for on other projects for some time. It is also an element of focus within that, because there's lobbying that's bound to fail, and there's lobbying, no matter how worthy, but there's lobbying that is that done properly can achieve quick change. So it's an element of inspiration as well as perspiration in how one does that sort of thing. Sorry, Beth, I cut across earlier.
Not at all. Vicky, you've got your hand up. Is that an old hand or a new hand? Quite all right.
Sorry, it was just to say that in terms of lobbying, there's an art, a process to success, and one of the shortcuts we can get Citizens Cymru past masters at it, And if we could get this agenda onto their table, we could work with them to achieve things. It's a suggestion. We would have to be members probably.
Lovely, thank you. It ties in with Mark, Chris and I, sorry, we're speaking earlier just about how do you get that, 2 + 2 = 5. So actually all of these amazing pockets of local things that are happening, how do you kind of amplify that and be able to share that, share the things that work. Liz, I think you were making a point in the chat about the kind of the need to both look to the future, but also kind of be really really present in the now. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. And just to kind of add on Camilla's point, I think it's incredibly important that anyone who's engaging with lobbying work has care for their own team. It's not nice going and talking to people who you know are ignoring you. So actually you have to build that in. Some people are very resilient on that, others aren't. But if we're about making it successful to everybody, that has to be part of your plan. But really the reason I kind of jumped in on the conversation on the chat, for context, I'm working specifically campaigning against genetic modification across the UK. And one of the problems that we at GM Freeze have been having and other organisations are having is that it's a lot of the funding and a lot of the focus of organisations is very much on positive solutions right now. And obviously we need positive solutions, that's incredibly important. But we can't get enough money to keep going on fighting against the basics. And I think there's a danger that we kind of get a bit idealistic about, oh, we've got such a great vision, that means everything will be okay. We can't drop the ball on the things that we're against. If, just by focusing on what we thought, it won't just fall out, that the bad things won't happen. We have to, as a movement, hold all of that. And I think perhaps more in England than or certainly on UK-wide stuff, and specifically in Wales, there's a lot of there's a whole stream of funding, the Farming the Future Fund, which is not funding anything that's about objecting anymore. Somebody who I won't name refers to it as all so much kumbaya, which I think is a little harsh, because it is, obviously we need solutions, but we can't fall into the trap of being the nice alternative. We have to be present in what we object to.
Great. Thank you. Does anybody want to come in on that just before I move us on to talking about procurement, everybody's favourite topic?
I would just like to
Camilla,
say,
sure.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, well said. It's much nicer to do things that people like you for doing, and you need people. You have to stop being afraid of not being liked. Otherwise, we won't get there. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you. Steve, Garrett, you've talked in the chat about kind of prioritising procurement around healthy local food, but I've gone on to say the kind of the link between that and building a sustainable food system. Would you say a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, I'm generally not a fan of top-down approaches to any sort of problem, and generally change comes the other way around in my experience. But there's always seemed to me, in terms of trying to create a sustainable food system for Wales, the two ways in which top-down would make a massive difference. I mean, I know Kevin Morgan at the university has been singing about this for so long, but is it too simple? Why can't I see what the problem is with actually prioritizing procurement from local producers? It puts a huge injection of our money, our tax money, into supporting local producers. And yes, it's going to cost more, and yes, it might mean a little bit more council tax. But my sense is that right now there's a receptivity to the cost of actually being more sustainable, accepting that, especially right now, post COP26 and all the rest of it, a general sort of interest in that. And the other way, I mean, I only just sort of tag on to that governments have the capacity to run campaigns which change public opinion in ways that none of us as individual groups are able to do. You know, we did it with drink driving, we've done it with smoking. You know, why don't we have a sort of investment in a campaign that explains to Welsh people why it's a really good idea to try to source locally? And yeah, if you go to your supermarket and they haven't got it, complain. You know, because I agree with whoever it was that says consumer power. Yeah, ultimately, it's people buying stuff that's going to affect the business model. And I said, you know, we know from our experience of the farmers markets in Cardiff, I mean, we're just a tiny, tiny little proportion of customers, but there's been a real, we're busier than ever, to be honest, because more and more people are looking for it. I just think that there needs to be some investment in a route to market infrastructure that makes it easier for people to get this stuff, and a campaign alongside that to back that up.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve. Anybody want to come in on that?
Yeah, hi, Steve. Yeah, no, good points. As a farmer who produces and sells red meat off the farm direct to consumers, there's a couple of challenges. It's really rewarding, not just financially, but just communicating with people that buy and eat your products, especially when they say that was good. But you know, we need sort of more local processing units as for red meat production, smaller are dotted around the counties sort of thing, not just these big supermarket style processors. They have a place obviously to supply big supermarkets. You know, currently I'm having an issue with my processor and the butcher. The butcher's just had an operation, so you know they are struggling to deal with my request before Christmas. So we do need a bit more opportunity. But as for consumers going to the supermarket and complaining, you know, go to the local shop, just go to the local butcher. Sort of when the smaller the supply of a butcher, you know, the more connection there is. That there's a classic example of how food production works. You know, growing food is quite simple. Most of us can do it. We need land, but the bigger the chain, there's more people involved, the more complex it gets. And I think going back to my point about government, they've been talking about procurement for local procurement for years. Councils have. They just need to do it. There's too much talking. Just do it. The facilities are there. Just do it. For example, the NRW, you know, they've given go-aheads to these chicken sheds, you know, and they know it's a broken system, but I think everybody's too scared to change or step up or even make a mistake. I think we've got a system where a lot of these people are just too scared to make a mistake in case they lose their pension sort of thing. Just let's do it. I'm fed up of too much talking and no action. You know, time's moving on. You know, we should have done something like yesterday, not in 3 years' time.
Thank you. There's quite a bit in kind of through the chat around kind of local supply chains, how to make it easy for people not to use supermarkets so much. Does anybody want to speak to that? That's fine. I'll share a link in a minute just to there's a couple of organisations like the Open Food Network who are trying to kind of look at the tech that sits underneath kind of what are the things that local suppliers need to be able to manage manage supplying lots of different shops, so they're not kind of bamboozled with a thousand spreadsheets. Okay. Holly, Camilla.
I just realised that we could look to other countries. I know in France and in Italy, supermarkets, I know they produce much more food anyway in the bigger countries, but supermarkets do all have local food. And I mean, we got the co-op in Knighton, people have asked them to stock local food, but, you know, because they have such particular standards and they want particular amounts, but supermarkets could be much more accommodating than they are. They could take the misshapen vegetables and all that. And I think, again, that needs pressure.
Anyone? We've got about 8 minutes left. I'm going to hand back over to Chris in a minute. I suppose we've got time for one more comment or question, if anybody's got anything that they would really like to say before we finish up.
Can I come in with a question to everybody, probably? Mm-hmm. So, like I discussed tree planting and corporations, investors buying up Welsh land. To me, it's just the end of rural communities. It's similar to building reservoirs and dams to supply water to a different country. What can we do to prevent the repeat of this sort of land grab again? And the fact that Welsh public money is going to offset an English company or corporation's carbon pollution, does it make our country carbon positive? Isn't that something to be really worried about? And Welsh government are really pushing this tree planting, isn't it? Trees is part of a solution. Raising livestock ruminants is, in my opinion, a lot of scientists' opinion, as good, if not better, than tree planting. I think we need the balance of the everything. So I don't know. We need to discuss this now and really do something about it.
I think it's really complicated, and that's why trees is such a simple. It comes across as such a simple solution, which is why it's so easy for so many people to get behind it, because it seems really simplistic. Okay, great, I can plant a tree and we're done, or I can buy this patch of land and it's done. But it completely loses all of that nuance, and it completely loses the people, the community, the language, and sometimes even the biodiversity aspect as well. So it's a case of how we come together to. I think that's sort of why I think within the Summit to Sea work, the narrative and the policy aspect has come out. People want to be pulling together to create a kind of counter narrative that these aren't just plains of unpeopled land without any culture or history. There's people here and there's life, and how can we demonstrate what's being done here is good, but also challenge to kind of always improve on ourselves. And I think that's definitely coming out from a lot of the farmers that I talk to, in terms of, we think we're doing good, but if we're not, we want to do better. But also, as Hall said, fed up of being kind of lumbered with the kind of the can't remember in English, the blame landing with them. So I don't think I've got an answer for you, Howell, but we just, I think coming together, and it's probably as appalling as thinking we need someone with a really good PR or communications head to work with us to try and present something that includes the complexity of what we all face in our everyday, to counter that simplistic message.
Thank you, Shan. And Holly is just highlighting a session tomorrow for anyone interested in agroforestry and approach to tree planting that benefits farmers. That's at 2 o'clock in the conference tomorrow. So I'm going to now hand back to Chris just to bring us home.
Well, I was just wondering how to pull all this together. There's a sense in the conversation, sort of David versus Goliath in a way, but one always has to remember that David beat Goliath. And as anybody who followed the story in detail would know, he was always going to, because he was fleeter of foot. One of the senses that came through this is that we have bodies in Wales that are responsible for these agendas, and there's a sense that they might mean well, but the consequence of what they're doing isn't actually addressed at the things that they need to be addressing it at. And in that way, there's 2 themes that have come out of this. One is lobbying. In other words, what is it this movement can do to try and persuade those people to do things in the right way, and to cure the unintended consequences. I think it might have been Vicky or Stephen who talked about how when the tree planting initiative, the National Forest of Wales came about, it sort of fell through the gap that they'd end up planting on land that could be used for agriculture, etc. So one is, how does one communicate this voice And the second is Sean's last point, I think, which is a PR and public campaign. That wins the people over, and the lobbying wins the influences over the people to do things. It was Stephen Garrett who said that there are direct things that our government could do here which could move what we're trying to achieve here forward in the right way. One would like to think that the individuals within those organisations would feel comfortable on this call, that they would be sympathetic to things that one's saying, and for the reasons Howell articulated, whether it's insecurity or power, or maybe stuck within an inadequate legislative framework that perhaps needs adapting. That you can boil this complicated discussion down to a number of small things that one could do that actually could make a difference. And as I started with, you're very good if 2 and 2 could make 5 very quickly. It's been a terrific conversation. Thank you very much to all the participants. Thank you to Camilla. Thank you to Howell. Thank you to Sean. Thank you to Beth for coordinating that discussion. Thank you to Jane for organising it. Apologies again for my systems crashing. I've been sitting here with my fingers and toes crossed. They weren't going to crash again, but they haven't. So I hope you found that discussion interesting. I hope we can catch a chat room and then have a discussion offline about what it is we do next. I'll certainly be taking these points and my extensive notes of the conversation back to the Food Farming Countryside Commission. Thank you all.